Hello there. My name is Keith Langley, and I worship in the Elmet Trinity benefice, and in particular at All Saints in Barwick in Elmet. Now, around about this time last year, last December, I had a phone call from a friend. He'd come home from work and he found that the doors were open and everything had been taken. Can you imagine how he felt? He said to me, Keith, that's the last time I buy an advent calendar. Okay, guys, sorry about that. My attempt at humour. Yes, advent calendars, though. It's 1st of December today. And throughout the world, millions and millions of advent calendars are being opened for the first time, door number one. And people are discovering what might be behind it. Of course, advent calendars can be quite sophisticated these days. They can have ones that sometimes you have chocolates behind them. I had one about 2 or 3 years ago. Somebody bought me one that had bottles of beer behind each door. That's a third of a pint. But when I was a child, advent calendars were far more simpler. The only thing you got behind each door was a picture. You'd open the door, and behind it would be a picture of a robin or a snowman or a Christmas tree or something seasonal and festive. And we seem to have moved on quite a bit since then. And perhaps we should go back to simpler times, and I could maybe do a reflection on that. But no, I'm going to give you a different reflection. I'm actually going to steal somebody else's material. I'm going to share with you some thoughts. It's a story, actually, a 19th century story by Henry van Dyke. It's a story that I heard first when I was at junior school, and I reused it more recently at an all-age worship at All Saints 4 or 5 years ago. So it may be that some of you have heard this story before. The all-age worship one, I modernised it a little bit. But even if you heard this story before, I'm sure you won't mind hearing it again. Let me do a bit of share screen now with you first. So let's click on that and click, 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 click. There we go. So now sharing screen. We don't know how many wise men there were. The Gospels don't tell us. Tradition has it is that there were three. If there were three, then Artaban was the fourth. He was the extra wise man, and he's not mentioned in the Bible. But like the other wise men, Artaban was one who studied the planets and the stars. And like the other wise men, he drew the same conclusions. The stars, the planets were all pointing to one thing, the birth of a new great king. And Artaban, well, what did he decide to do? I tell you what he did. He sold his house. He sold all his possessions and used the money to buy some gifts for this new king. A sapphire, beautiful, great big blue sapphire, bigger than any sapphire you'll have ever seen, I'm sure. A ruby as well, fantastic, huge, great ruby, and a wonderful pearl, a bit like the pearl of great price that Jesus would later talk about in one of his parables. And so Artaban got these gifts together using the money from the sale of his property and his possessions and headed off. He wanted to catch up with the other wise men. But after many weeks of difficult travel and frustrating delays, one night he saw a man lying in the road. The man was sweating profusely and breathing very heavily. It was clear that this man had a fever, quite a serious one at that. Artaban, he had to catch up with the other wise men. He was already behind. He couldn't stop. He couldn't stop. He'd got to carry on. But as he passed the man lying in the road, the man cried out, "Help me!" And Artaban knew that he couldn't just leave this man in the road. And so he got down from his donkey and ministered to the man. Artaban had some herbs with him, And although the science wasn't understood in those days, these herbs were believed to help people with a fever. He gave the man the herbs. He gave him some bread and some wine. The man was very grateful and said to Artaban, "Thank you. Unfortunately, I can't repay you. But there's one thing I can do. This great king that you're seeking, our prophets have predicted that he won't be born in Jerusalem. Instead, he will be born in Bethlehem. That's the place you should be going to." Well, Artaban headed off to catch up with the other wise men. But when he got there to the rendezvous point, this was what awaited him. "Yep, sorry, Artaban, we waited as long as we could. Can't wait any longer. Follow us across the desert." Oh dear. Well, what did Artaban do? He went back to Babylon. And when he got to Babylon, he sold one of the gifts that he'd intended to give to the new king, the sapphire. And he used the money to buy a train of camels in order to make the journey to Bethlehem. He headed off to Bethlehem. And when he got there we go, going to Bethlehem. When he got there, he met a lady touching a small child. "You're too late," she said. "The king you come to seek has gone. Your colleagues have been already. They presented the child and his parents with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then they've hurried off because even now Herod's soldiers are on their way. Herod fears that this new king will take his throne." Even as they spoke, the soldiers arrived. "Oh no, help me, help me," cried the lady. So Artaban took out the ruby and gave it to the soldier who looked to be the leader of the troop. "Here," he said. "Okay, men," shouted the soldier. "Search all the houses as instructed. I've looked in this one. There's no children in this property." "Thank you, thank you," said the lady. "You saved the life of my child." Artaban, on the other hand, sighed. Now he'd parted with two of the gifts he'd intended to give to this new king. He'd only got the pearl left. Well, Artaban spent the next 33 years of his life searching for this king. By now he was old and ill himself. Every time he arrived at some place, the king, Jesus, had just nicely moved on to somewhere else. He never seemed to get to him at the right time. But then he heard some news. He heard that a great leader was due to be executed in Jerusalem by crucifixion. This was surely the person that Artaban had been seeking all those years. He headed off to Jerusalem. But just as he got there, he saw some Roman soldiers dragging a girl behind them in chains. "Help me! Help me!" she cried. "I'm going to be sold into slavery." Artaban knew what he must do. He took out his purse, took out the pearl, held it one last time, and gave it to the Roman soldiers and bought the girl's freedom. Well, that's it. He took out the pearl. Artaban sat by the roadside, head in hands. Now he had no gifts left to give to the king, and he'd not been able to see him at all. Unlike his colleagues, it was all over. But as he lay there, or sat there, in the road, thinking about how he'd missed the king, he heard a voice in his head. The voice was clearly the voice of the very king that he was seeking. And the voice said, Artaban knew then that he had met the king. He had met Jesus many, many times during the course of his 33-year search. Not only had he met the king, but he'd been able to give the gifts that he'd intended to give. Maybe, just maybe, there's a bit of Artaban in each and every one of us.